One thing is certain after preseason week number 2, and it might be the most important thing about this preseason. That's coming up today on Locked On Chiefs.
From the land of the free and the home of the Chiefs, this is the Locked On Chiefs podcast.
Welcome back, friends and neighbors. Chiefs Kingdom around the world. You have a win under your belt. A lot of talk we had post-game last night with Matt Derrick. Make sure you go check that out if you missed it. It was a little bit late. That's all right. But we're going to go over what is the most important factor today and honestly what's going to help drive what happens to the roster coming up here very, very quickly. A lot to go over today. I'm Ryan Tracy, the founder of Rogue Analytics and Performance Consulting, NFL33.com, and RGR Football. Thanks for making us your first listen. Make sure you check out another Locked On show for your next listen today because there's information all over the place. We are free on every platform, every day, all the time, whether you like it or not, especially bonus episodes like you got on Saturday. So check that out. And if you want even more, get in the action on the text line at 816-357-8781. Whew. What happened last night and where are we going from here, Chris? What do you got?
And I'm Chris Clark from Chiefs Corner. There's a ton to talk about when you look at last night's game. And one of the things that sticks out to me is Mahomes talked about it after the game last night. And we didn't actually get a chance to watch the post-game conferences because we were sitting here recording. But one of the things that sticks out was he said, he told his offensive line, guys, I like to at least get hit in the preseason. He didn't get touched on any of the times that he was actually in the ball game. And the first string offensive line, I don't think let any QB get touched, whether it was Gabbert, whether it was Bichelle, whether it was Mahomes. So that offensive line looks like it's gelled pretty well. Granted, Arizona doesn't have the best defense. Take that with a grain of salt, obviously. But he still had 4 seconds to throw the ball at times last night, and no one even close.
He got a lot of help, and we're brought to you today by our friends at BetterHelp. If you're thinking of getting therapy, give BetterHelp another try. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockdown and get 10% off of your first month right now. And whether it's the mental preparation side or the physical, like you said, Arizona's defensive line is not exactly what it used to be. J.J. Watt is off in retirement. Honestly, that was a test that they should have passed, but they looked very, very good doing it. And that's really, I think, what the big takeaway, and we talk so much about the skill positions all preseason because that's where the change is. That's where the new excitement is. But we really haven't talked enough about this offensive group, given that the two most important positions, and this depends on your point of view. If you are a defensive coordinator, you're going to say the most important position is the tackle rather than the interior offensive lineman. But if you're a quarterback, you probably rely on the center a little bit more than that, but that's a whole different conversation. Having 2 new tackles and having them come together, whether it was against an elite opponent or not, and have 2 strong performances, this one being that much better than we saw week 1 of the preseason, the transition to Donovan Smith and Juwan Taylor, that I think has been pretty smooth so far. I haven't seen them get tested too much. I'm not concerned about them coming together. How do you see the offensive line as a group?
Well, I think if you look at what we saw offensively, what we talked about, and we talked about this leading up into training camp, leading up into the preseason games, and in the offseason once they brought in Donovan Smith. The big question was, which Donovan Smith are you going to get? Are you going to get the one from a couple years ago where he's a great tackle, or are you going to get what you got last year? Now, I want to be clear when I say this. Part of what he struggled with last year was once he got injured. So that's definitely always going to be something to watch. If he gets injured and he tries to play through it, that could become an issue. But what we've seen right now is he's still a fantastic offensive tackle, and he is at worst a good stopgap this year for the Chiefs at left tackle.
The great thing, and Patrick alluded to it, is whether it's Donovan right now, whether they have to make an adjustment midseason or anything like that, getting a little bit of contact is probably what Patrick wants. That's absolutely not the offensive line's goal right now, as of last night. 27 reps for each of the starting offensive linemen, 2 hurries, no contacts whatsoever. And if you're somebody who tracks sacks, understandable, that's the net result that you're really looking for. But pressures are always more important because it gives you an opportunity to get a sack. And one of the things that I always track is contacts with the quarterback. How many hits does he take, whether it's hits to the ground or the actual sack to the ground, etc. But for him not to be touched, he's probably a little antsy. But I will say, calm down, Patrick. They did their job. Leave them alone because you want those games where you don't get touched.
And I agree with that, but I also understand where he's coming from. It gets you back into the feel of like you're playing football. mean, that's just the reality of it. So I get why he said it, and I understand that, he was just giving the line a hard time. He took it in stride last night. He said, I probably played the worst of all the QBs on this team last night. And if you look at QB rating, he did. Say what you want about the rest of the roster, and we've talked about the QBs, we talked about the skill positions, but the offensive line has really showed out in 2 games, and that is important. And the reason that becomes even more important, and I think you and I have talked about this a little bit too, offensive line is so much harder to develop than defensive line, and that is such a huge key going forward. If you look at generally speaking, when you watch, getting down into the second, third, and fourth teams of most teams across the NFL, they don't have good offensive linemen in those units. Kansas City showed that they can go maybe even 2 or 3 deep at some positions on the offensive line. Now, I'm not saying you want to, but to have the ability to do that when most teams can't even get 5 guys that they're happy with, the Bills are struggling to get an offensive line that they feel good about right now. There are multiple teams across the NFL that are struggling to get offensive lines. The Jets are another one. And you look at both those teams in the AFC East that talk about being a threat to Kansas City, their offensive lines could shove both of them out of contention just because they're that bad. Miami could be struggling too with Teron Armstead going down.
Very, very good point, because depth is where it plays. And folks are talking about in the chat, folks, we are live. If you happen to be with us, then put your comments into the chat live. If not, if you're watching us on replay, go ahead and give us your thoughts in the actual comments on the replay video itself. But how does that come together, and where does that play in? I think it's changing the story of what the 53 is going to look like. We're going to get into that next.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Have you ever struggled with trying to decide if you want to switch jobs or looking for a job? There are some times in life that we face with tough choices, and the path forward isn't always easy. Definitely when you start looking at taking different career paths, that is definitely one of those things that it makes a lot easier to have somebody to talk to about it. Trusting yourself to make decisions that align with your values is like anything. The more you practice it, the easier it gets. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon.
I like getting help, and I like getting it from a group that I know is going to be consistent. And that's the big question about where the depth comes in. We started this camp talking about 4 wide receivers, 4 running backs, 7 wide receivers. The offensive line is making a run here to say, okay, now that we've had an injury at the tight end spot, we've had some lack of performance from the running back spot, we're taking some of those roster spots back. The offensive line as a group is saying, don't forget about us, because they had 9 guys that had a perfect pass rush efficiency last night. I mean, they didn't give up a pressure. And that's all through the roster and the depth chart. And I'm only talking about guys that have 14 snaps plus. There are a couple of guys that didn't play quite as much, like Jerome Carvin, who didn't give up pressure either, but I'm not really counting that just because the volume of snaps was down. But as you look at it, we'll talk risers and fallers because of that later. But what this tells you is that guys like Caliendo, Kennard, Godric, I think, is probably the shock of this group, that are standing out as viable against their level of competition. Are they ready to be starters? No. But nobody keeps 10 starters on an offensive line unit in the NFL. You keep 5 starters, you keep guys that you hope you can project to that level, that you can coach up to that level in case you have to. And I feel like this group is really, really strong right now, again, versus the level of competition they faced.
No, I agree. And, you talk about Godric. I think that's a guy that is going to be a perfect practice squad candidate, and he may end up having to be there for 1 or 2 years. Who cares? Doesn't really matter. It's a question of whether or not you can develop depth on that position group. You look at a guy like Joe Thuney, and I don't want to get too deep into this because we're not talking about cap and all of that and rosterology, but you look at a guy like Joe Thuney, who this may be his last year. We don't know. Now, Godric isn't a guy that's going to step in and take his position, but you do have a guy in Allegretti. You've been trying to develop a guy like Kennard for several years. Is that going to be a guy that's going to step into that position next year? We don't know. We'll see how that ends up. But my whole point when you start looking at that is you're going to have guys to replace, and you're going to have guys to be swing guys, or they can play all along the interior, which is another reason why I think Allegretti is such a key to this team. Even though he didn't play last night, I'm pretty sure he would have had good grades as well.
Yeah, I feel very confident in that. Some of the guys that were on the second and third teams showing out that way, Caliendo being one. My guy, Anderson Hardy, who only got 7 pass rush snaps, didn't give up pressure. PFF, for some reason, graded him nearly absent, but is somebody that, like, getting those reps is making the churn that you have to get this whole unit better, tougher, able to step in across the board. And Allegretti's certainly going to be the leader of them because of his experience, but you got to have some fresh blood too. And while I do think Nick can play all 3 interior positions, it's the tackles that I think are going to be most poignant. We're going to talk about them in the next segment here about who's going where, because I do think it got a little bit muddy. But on the interior 3, clearly she's having an elite trio, a triangle of death, I call it. You guys can get that t-shirt on RGR store if you want. But having the ability to swap guys in, whether it's Allegretti or the next man, how do you feel right now? Austin Ryder was in a different situation where he actually played with the 2s, whereas I didn't think he necessarily outplayed the other centers on this roster right now. How do you feel about, is there a reason to keep a backup center specifically, or does it need an interior swing guy?
I think it's going to be Allegretti. I don't think that Ryder is going to be kept. He may be a guy that they keep on the practice squad, but it's also possible if they look at a young guy like Carvin and say, okay, well, maybe he's not going to be the center of the future, but can he be an interior 3 guy that can come in and take Allegretti's place? Allegretti is going to be a free agent after 2023. I know we're trying to talk about this season, but we're talking about depth, and we're talking about getting players ready for the future. It's all about having guys that you think can play in the next 2 to 3 years. And that is what we're looking at when we look at the preseason. Granted, we're talking about guys that can play right now, but it does matter about who you're developing behind them.
This is all making me feel like Carvin's a great example because he has positional variability as well. So Allegretti's the 6th lineman. I don't think either of us disagree with that. So there's no question he'll be here. But how much do you supplement him in case of an injury? He really has had a pretty clean career in terms of injury time. So you got to feel pretty good about that. Carvin's on the list. I think Ryder at his age is probably destined for the practice squad as a emergency call-up type situation. Yep. And I think that you're looking for that. But the rest of the interior, I think, is where it kind of varies. I feel like Kennard's played his way onto this roster, and it's really not much of a question in my mind. Do you agree?
I think he's on the roster. The question is do you want to go with a guy like Caliendo who you keep bringing back and nobody else seems to bring? Or do you want him on the practice squad and keep a guy who I think Kennard would actually get picked from the practice squad if they tried to get him there? I don't think that somebody is going to look at Caliendo and try to take him. I understand he may have played better at times this preseason, but there's a reason they are able to keep bringing him back year after year after year versus a guy like Darian Kennard. They drafted him. I don't think anybody expected him to be available in the 5th round. They got him in the 5th round. I don't think you want to let loose of that just yet.
Yeah, I completely agree. So the competition to be maybe that 7th guy, probably not. That's going to be one of the tackles. There's 18,000 of them. We'll get to them here in a minute. But that competition to be the next interior guy, the 5th interior player, I think that's where it's going to heat up now. And we're going to have to figure that out. And it is about longevity. So despite having, like you said, we're not talking about next year, but this year leads into next. And we have to keep that in mind. So that said, who's moving up? Who's moving down? What surprised us and who muddied the waters? We're going to get to that coming up next. But first, it is football season. If you didn't know that already, you're about to find that out because as all of our viewership comes back, we always see this surge this time of year because football season is about to kick off officially. And FanDuel's there to give you the chance to win all season long. Right now, they have a bet going for the Super Bowl winner, and you can get a bonus that every time they win during the regular season. So every time that team that you pick wins, you get a bonus. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl and you'll get bonus bets with every single victory. You can then go back and bet spreads, props, over-unders, who does what, when, where, and how, and more. It's FanDuel.com/lockedon to get that deal and start earning those bonus bets in America's #1 sports book. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. You can go check it out today. I think you guys will be pretty pumped. Now, what I'm pumped about is that I was concerned going into the season, I have to say. I felt like there was a couple of tackles. I thought there was a lot of question marks after that. Now, after preseason game number 2, what I felt was a pretty, I won't say strict, but a pretty locked down hierarchy. It all went out the window with preseason game number 2 in terms of the offensive tackle depth. It was not Juani Morris, who had played in the first preseason game as the immediate guy off the bench. It was a pair in Prince Tega Wanago on the right and Lucas Niang on the left of all places, coming in and playing significant reps, playing more reps than Juani Morris got. We'll talk about his performance in a second, but did that surprise you? And did either of them stand out to you as a guy that you feel can be a true swing side to side, given that now they've both gotten reps in preseason on both positions?
I think it is, Matt kind of talked about this last night a little bit, and I think we talked about it as well. I think it's pretty close. I think you look at that competition between the two of those guys, and it's really close. The big difference is you drafted Niang in the 3rd round. He hasn't been able to stay healthy. That's one of the reasons he's not a guy that you have been putting on this offensive line. So the real question is are you willing to take a risk? And the bigger key here, and this is what we don't know. We know how he looked on the field, but we don't know how they feel about his knee or his knees and how they feel about his re-injury risk. And that's going to be the big question, I think, when it comes down to a question of, is it Prince Tega Wanago or is it Lucas Niang? Do you feel like Lucas Niang can stay healthy? If he can, then maybe you can lean that direction. But otherwise, it's Prince. And I don't think you can go – I think you have to be able to know how you feel about his health before you can make that decision.
I agree. And again, as we discussed earlier, Arizona's defensive front is clearly not elite in this league. But the concerning bit is here against twos, it was both of them that played pretty well. In the end, Lucas Niang graded out better, according to PFF, than Prince Tega Wanago did. Both of them, unfortunately, were significantly better than Juani Morris. And that's my big concern because I don't know what the difference was because I felt and I'll have to double check. Juani Morris played significantly more snaps and significantly better against a better defensive front in New Orleans than he did against threes from Arizona. Something happened this week during practice that I'm sure we didn't pick up on, the media didn't pick up on at all. None of the beat reporters had anything to say about it, but something has shifted there, and I'm not sure what it is, but I'm starting to get concerned because you can't get rid of Juani Morris. He's got to be on the roster given your investment in him.
I don't know that I agree with you in that regard. I would say that it's possible that they're just looking at a scenario of, we know Juani Morris is going to be on this roster. He's going to get a ton of snaps in game 3. We need to see and get more good tape on these two guys that we've got to decide between. And I understand he didn't play great against the threes, and I understand that's a problem. But at the same time, I go back to what I said before. You start getting into a point where you have deeper depth at defensive line across the entire NFL than you have at offensive line. So you're going to have a better defensive line at your 3rd, 4th than you're ever going to have offensive line. Maybe that played into it a little bit with Juani Morris, but I still go back to the fact that he is going to play a ton in week number 3 because he's not going to be a guy that's going to be starting. He's going to be a backup regardless, and maybe they're looking at this as more of a redshirt year for Juani Morris anyway. And they need to figure out between those other two, are we going to keep both? Are we going to keep one? Who are we going to keep? And we need a higher level of competition to determine who we're going to keep.
Yeah, that brings out the best in everyone. So at the end of the day, do you feel that they have to keep 5 at this point? Would you lean towards them keeping all 3 of these guys, trying to cut someone or trying to trade someone?
I think obviously I think if you trade, if you can get a trade, I think you do. Because generally speaking, I don't think that you're going to have a chance to keep all of them on the practice squad regardless. Maybe I could be wrong in that regard. But it goes back to what I said before. Offensive line is a tough position. We said it when we were talking about wide receivers yesterday as well. That's another position where I think if you can make a trade, you go try to make a trade and try to get something for a guy like Amir Smith-Arcette because he can't be on this roster. I'd love him to be on the practice squad, but if you're going to lose him regardless, see if you can get something for him. I personally would not keep all three of them, mainly because you're in such a roster lock when you start looking at the roster numbers regardless. If you keep 4 running backs, we already talked about last night, you're keeping 3 quarterbacks. Mm-hmm. You're keeping 7 wide receivers. How many tight ends are you going to be able to keep? I mean, and then you start getting into the defensive line where you're going to have some big issues, especially with Chris Jones not showing up. We don't know when he's going to show up at this point, but he's on the active roster at this point. And that's another spot you don't know what you're going to do with. And then you start looking at DBs. That becomes another deeper spot that you're going to have to figure out as well. So I don't see them keeping 5 tackles. I see them probably keeping 9 total.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm coming around on that as well. So we'll see what this week brings. One more big ball game to get some reps in. We'll get you prepared. Tomorrow, what does the defense need to shift to? What do they need to look like going forward? And is there any more clarity about any of the skill positions on the offensive side? Matt Derrick will be back with us on Wednesday, and Thursday we'll be looking ahead yet again. So make sure you're with us. Like, sub, hit that bell on YouTube. Remember, we're here 5 days a week for you. You every dayers already know that, but we're here constantly. We give you bonus episodes. We cover this team at any moment, anytime. If there is news on Chris Jones, you will hear it here at 816-357-8781. You can get on the text line, and that will probably be the fastest way to get breaking news. So we appreciate you guys spending your time with us today. For those of you that are live on a Sunday, for those of you that are listening this Sunday night into Monday, enjoy your week. Get going because we got more football coming at you and more decisions to be made. Thanks for spending your time with us today, and we'll talk to you tomorrow